at the Textile Arts program at Portland State University, and this is one of a number of events we're hosting this term, but we're really excited to have Kyle and Rhonda with us at this wonderful exhibition to supplement some of the things that are happening in our curriculum. The Textile Arts curriculum is in the art practice program at Portland State University, and we teach processes in weaving, surface design, and stone construction, where students can use that towards applications in fashion, costume, contemporary art, or in the case that you're sort of seeing here, you know, amazing work that engages all of these kinds of aspects of you know, clothing. And so, yeah, we are just so thrilled to be just joining you all today and live streaming this from the Parallax Art Center, which has a really fantastic exhibition for folks that are online today. Cloth construct culture, fashion builds a story, that's curated by Rhonda P. Hill. And today we're going to be talking to Kyle Denman, who's one of the designers featured in this exhibition, which just opened last night. So before we get started, I just wanted to send like a huge thanks to Parallax for even hosting an exhibition like this. We don't get fashion exhibitions in Portland very much. So it's really like a major thing to be able to have this here and have us actually experience and see these clothes in person. And then I wanted to just also thank Marvin and Lala for helping us set up everything today. Thank you all. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that both Parallax Art Center and Portland State University are located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon, and Multnomah County. And that we just want to honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on. The Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of Chinook, the Tualatin Kayupuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It's important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Today, we have set up our talk as a facilitated conversation between Kyle and Rhonda, and which will open up to a Q&A at the end. And for folks that are joining us on Zoom, please feel free to type your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll make sure that they get answered at the end. So, but it's my great pleasure to introduce Kyle Denman. Kyle Denman is a political scientist turned designer. He was named the Forbes inaugural 30 under 30 local in Los Angeles list for his astute ambition to change the culture of the industry, and was the winner of the 2021 International Design Award Fashion Designer of the Year. Cal utilizes his design practice as an educator and has taught fashion design and art to youth, those who have been victimized or have experienced trauma through human trafficking, domestic abuse, gang violence, and are victims of a socially marginalized system. He was recently named the executive director of Arts Bridging the Gap, a Los Angeles-based organization that uplifts youth from underserved communities through art programs. Thank you, Kyle, for joining us today. And interviewing Kyle today is curator Rhonda P. Hill. Rhonda is an international fashion industry analyst, curator, publisher, and editor of edgeexpo.com, and founder of the global platform Edge Fashion Intelligence. Her Edge platform claims a unique space within the fashion industry for elevating design excellence while conveying an intelligent approach to fashion design and production, involving the shifting dynamics of identity and the deep ecological thinking for the sustainability necessary for our future. Thank you so much for having this wonderful conversation with both of us.
We're both very happy to be here. This has been such a journey to be able to exhibit work like this. What you're going to see in this exhibition are contemporary designers that actually tell a story, and they construct beautiful collections like what Kyle has constructed by storytelling. So, we're going to first start to talk about Kyle, his background and his journey, and how he, his road of getting here. So that's really the first question. Before I get into that, I want to kind of ground you on who he is. So this is a quote from Kyle that from an interview that we had earlier part of this year. Kyle says, "Fashion is the most powerful art that exists. It is the intersection of design, movement, and architecture, juxtaposed in social, political, and cultural contexts. And he frames it within the dynamic of the nature that it is. He says, fashion is expression, communication, and activism. It is inherently political yet neutral, communal yet personalized, and silent yet loud. It's paradoxical and nuanced, just like the human experience, which is pretty much the basis of building this collection that we're going to talk about. So let's start with that.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for just having me here today. I really genuinely appreciate it. And Rhonda, I can't express my gratitude enough for you for thinking about me. This experience has been over a year in the making. So it's really an honor. My background, it might be a little atypical or unconventional, but my background actually started in political science. I was working in nonprofit policy. That's what I studied in undergrad. I'm the former youth mayor of Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up. I've written legislation to support systems impacted populations and youth. And when I was working in the nonprofit and social impact space, I was working with organizations like the NAACP or with the Down Syndrome Association of Greater Cincinnati, but I was also working with Scripps Gerontology. And I was working with them on research on a program they have called Opening Minds Through Art, OMA, which was an intergenerational program that they developed where they partnered young people with people who have dementia, Alzheimer's, and other neurocognitive disorders in art making. I've always loved art. I always wanted to be an artist when I was younger, but was told that I could never make a career off of it. And for me, when I saw how art was impacting not only young people, but also these people who were essentially at the very late stages of their lives in such profound ways, that's when I had to revisit that conversation internally and say, I need to be an artist. It was exceptional to see a woman who couldn't even recall the names of her own kids, but when she painted with the color purple, it brought back all of her memories from college because that was her university's color. So in 2016, I left that field at the time, and I moved out to Los Angeles, California, where I'm currently based. I went back to school to study fashion, and I honestly feel like I got really lucky. I really do. When I first moved out to LA, I had no experience in design or sewing, but I worked hard. I met a lot of incredible people who really supported my journey. I was very fortunate in that same year. I actually received or was named the grand prize winner of the Project Runway Remake It Work contest, which when I moved out to LA, that elevated my experience tremendously. It really opened up a lot of doors. It was hard though. I didn't know how to sew. I was under a lot of pressure, even in the sewing rooms at the school where I was attending, the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. The pressure that you're under, it escalates even more and more as the temperatures rise in that sewing room with all the machines on. And I was very fortunate. I had some incredible professors. I had some incredible mentors who really guided me in the process. I've always wanted to be in the art space. And for me, being a designer, being in the fashion industry, it's been challenging because so often people consider fashion as to be something that's so utilitarian, something with a purpose of keeping you warm or, something that has a very specific commercialized purpose. But to me, that wasn't the art that I wanted to create. So I wanted to create something that was a little bit more poetic, a little bit more conceptual. So in 2018, that's when I had my first fashion show in Los Angeles. And then that was April, the beginning of April that year. Fast forward a week, I had the opportunity to actually work on the wardrobe team for Beyonce for Coachella, which was incredible. And such a wonderful opportunity that presented itself to me through one of my mentors who really guided me. And then at the end of that month, I had a fashion show in New York City for the first time. And it was a competition where I was then named the Young Fashion Designer of the Year from an international platform. So all these experiences really helped me propel my voice in the fashion industry. My mission really is to ignite a culture of change through creativity and curiosity. And I think so much of that can be done through fashion. So in Los Angeles, I was volunteering and I was actually teaching art and design to underserved communities of color. So I was working all over Los Angeles and I was leading art and design programs for youth who had experienced things like Allison mentioned, human trafficking, housing insecurity, gang violence. And to see them learn first off within Los Angeles, which there's so much going on technically, right? From a design standpoint, to see them learn how to sew. So that way then they could possibly get a job where, they had no money, they were living in poverty beforehand. That was really special to have them work with me and to give them the opportunity to possibly, create their own futures. But what's more impactful was the fact that through the lenses of art and fashion design, they were learning more about themselves. We might have been doing a partnership with an eyeglasses company or sunglasses, and they got to design their own pairs of sunglasses, learn about the marketability of what that could be from a retail perspective. But then we would have these conversations about what sunglasses are we wearing in our own lives? What are you trying to hide from the world? And maybe what are you trying to shield yourself away from what the world could possibly see? What bruises do we have on our bodies that we try and cover up? Not physically, but emotionally, internally. So I was doing that for a number of years. And then I was actually named 30 under 30 Change Maker in Education in 2021 for that work. So that year was a big year because that was the year I showed at New York Fashion Week for the first time. And I originally got the call to do New York Fashion Week in September of 2020. So at the height of the pandemic. And I asked them, is it okay if I could push it back a season? I don't want to travel right now. They said, that's totally fine. February 2021 comes around, COVID is worse. So I asked them to push it back again, and they said, don't worry. So then finally I was able to present my first collection at New York Fashion Week, Multipolar Existence, which is right behind me. And it was very special. And I'll get into that a little bit, but my journey's really been a lot of fun. And even though it's taken so many different turns professionally and career-wise, it all comes together. So I actually am now the executive director of a social impact organization that's countywide in Los Angeles. Where now, instead of working with a small cohort of young people, I'm working with thousands of young people all across LA, where we're bringing the arts to them. We're meeting them physically where they need to be met. We're meeting them where they need to be met emotionally and creatively in terms of self-expression. So it's really exciting. Now I get to work with artists all over LA. So I'm expanding the creative economy through this. I get to, as the executive director, put my nonprofit policy hat back on and utilize that experience. But more importantly, and I think this is where I think design and fashion can really meet art. We are protecting what the cultural zeitgeist is of the time because we are painting with my artists and young people murals all over Los Angeles. In 2020, Arts Bridging the Gap actually painted the largest Black Lives Matter movement mural in North America. And it's exceptional because we've just finished our 76th mural last week. We're preparing to paint our 77th, 78th, 79th, and 80th murals in the next 2 weeks. And what's so exciting is we're recording what the zeitgeist is, but from the most honest perspective possible. The perspective of a child who is co-creating the design with my professional artists. So it's a lot of fun and I'm really excited. But through that work, through my work in fashion, I was then just named on the inaugural list for Forbes 30 Under 30 Los Angeles, which again helped boost my career substantially for the platform and the vision that I want to have for design. And speaking of just my design process, the collection behind me, Multipolar Existence, is deeply personal. It was inspired by the multidimensionality and the interconnectivity of the human experience. So I wanted it to be summarized in 6 words: soulmates will always find a way. In the actual garments, I have silhouettes of people's faces, in the sleeves of this first look, in the skirt of that yellow look. And it's meant to represent a number of things, right? Maybe it represents a specific person to me, that soulmate that I considered. Maybe it represents your soulmate. Maybe it represents you yourself looking back at an actual outfit. So I have a lot of fun working with a lot of different design techniques, playing with the stories I want to share. So it's been just wonderful. So that's been my experience in design so far.
Oh my goodness, I'm exhausted. Okay, this guy is not 40-year-old. He's quite young and he has a lot of accomplishments. So yes, I applaud you. Yes. And I really love how you take your design practice and broaden it with your social practice. I think that's amazing. And so I think it's a wonderful attribute that you have. So
Thank you
for that too. So, okay, so let's talk about multipolar systems. It's very sculptural. In this file, you see face profiles. There's a reason for that. There's a reason for the color yellow. And when you see it on the runway, and I think at some point the Parallax Art Center will actually have this runway video. But when you see it on the runway, you see a lot of movement. So when a lot of people is wearing it, they're walking. There's movement, particularly in this yellow exterior. I see the movement. So it's quite strong. It's quite powerful, and the messaging is just amazing. So talk to us a little bit about wherever you want to start with all the things I just said. I mean, it's color or profiles, but it's such a powerful collection.
Yeah, so the whole process that I have when developing a collection, I start by actually writing an essay, which for those of you who are here today, feel free to take a look at the little table, and I have that essay. I have little blurbs about each outfit because each outfit has a meaning and a story, and it's additive to the actual collection. So I start with an essay about what story do I want to share? What narrative do I want to get across? And what's great for that is whenever I get lost during the actual creative process and I need to really rethink about where I'm headed in terms of a creative direction, I'm always able to refer back to that essay to act as my North Star. So I really wanted to detail what the human profile could look like, both figuratively, but also literally in the actual face profiles. I really wanted to take these conversations, again, very conceptual, very poetic, and really create this possibility where the emotions that we experience as humans can be explored in a visual way. So, for example, the color yellow, that was just to talk about it, that was chosen very specifically because on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the third tier, which consists of belonging, is typically the color yellow. It's also very paradoxical in different cultures and religions. It means different things. It could mean a sign of innocence and purity, but also cowardice and degradation. So I thought there was a lot of really interesting nuance specifically with that color. And also it was a color that I think is really challenging to work with. And I wanted to challenge myself in order to actually create all of these silhouettes. Each outfit has a name. So the first piece that walked on the runway, which again, because of the pandemic, my runway show at New York Fashion Week was actually on a rooftop in Manhattan. So I kind of got lucky because it was an incredible backdrop for the actual collection. But the first look that appeared was this look, detachment. It's inspired by a quote by the author Albert Camus. And never have I felt so deeply at one and now detached from myself and so present in the world. It's meant to evoke this feeling of suffocation and apathy. It's also meant to be very ominous. On the runway, when the model walked out, all you could see barely were her eyes. And that's significant in this collection, actually. And then you would see from a very vague perspective, the actual faces in the profiles, or the face profiles in the sleeves. And they were created out of tool to give that illusion of, are those faces? We can't really tell. They're moving, they are a little bit shadowy. So maybe we're just mistaken. And then it moves into other looks where the face profiles are actually solid. So then you start thinking, oh, I am looking at faces. And the second look was called Derealization. And that look's not here today, but it was inspired by, I think, stories that maybe many of us have experienced. I don't know. And how many of us here today have ever felt like we met a soulmate once, but we lost contact with them? I know I have. For me, I wanted to tell a story of maybe someone you met on a train, it's incredibly romantic, or on a flight traveling. And then as soon as you got off that train or off that plane, you walked in separate directions and never met again. Maybe it's a little less romantic and you're at a club or a bar up all night long having the best time with a stranger. And the same thing, the sun rises and you depart ways, never to meet again. I know I've had that experience. And in the actual skirt, it was a jacket and a skirt. In the skirt of that piece, of that look, I embroidered two people's faces, one in white thread and one in yellow. I just used line art, and the lines cross once, and through the embroidery, they never meet again. But there's hanging threads that are there that I left. So maybe they reconnect at some point in the future, or maybe they don't. So I want to really dive deeply into what the human experience could be. This third look, circularity, which I will be honest, before the runway show, had the most negative feedback about it. I was about to get rid of it. I didn't know what to do with it. I was feeling pretty demoralized based on the feedback I had already been receiving. But as soon as it hit the runway, people loved it. And I really think that goes, a lot of it is owed to the model who wore it on the runway. I remember telling her, if people don't like this, if we get negative feedback, it's the design, it's me, it's not you. You're beautiful, you're stunning. I told her, people think it's a little too weird. I wanted it to be artistic. I wanted it to be weird, but people said it's weird as a negative. And that model, her name's Tiara, she looked at me and said, Kyle, let's show the world how good weird is, and walked on the runway. And then it's been on the covers of magazines, it's been in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. So I really owe that model a lot to the success of this look. And this look is really meant to represent, where do we exist in our lives? I think so often we as people can also be very selfish in this idea of, or maybe it's not selfish, maybe it's about survival, about we are at the epicenter of a circle. We are the ripple in our lives. And from there, our sphere of influence expands. But perhaps we exist where two circles meet. We exist where other people's lives are intersecting. Maybe that's where we belong. Or maybe because there's multiple layers, maybe we exist in multiple spaces. And how do we own that? So now we're getting a little bit more conceptual with that look. But I really wanted to share what all of these different emotions could be for the human experience. And like Rhonda said, there was a lot of movement on the runway. The 7th of the 8th looks, Vibration, which is behind me. If you can see in the actual skirt, there are hundreds of people's faces, the profiles of their faces that were individually hand sewn. And when the model walked on the rooftop, they just swayed back and forth. And this look was meant to represent how someone can impact your life forever. And that impact can then go on and on and on, whether it be impacting your own life over and over, or whether it be impacting other people's lives. I really think about, for example, my mentor who helped teach me how to sew when I first moved out to LA, who helped get me the job with Beyonce for Coachella, and how because she helped me, I have been able to explore so many different avenues. I would honestly say without her help learning how to even sew a straight line, I probably wouldn't be here today. So it really goes to show how the impact of people can really influence you and so many others, whether they realize it or not. So as the dress would walk down the runway, all of the actual faces would kind of hit each other, moving back and forth, so that it created sort of wave of poetry that I really wanted to visualize. So that's definitely one of the happier looks. But in contrast, this other look behind me is meant to represent anxiety, and that's what it's called. So if you can tell, again, I wanted to play with single line art embroidery. I embroidered the Scream by Edward Monk. So in the center of the actual garment is that character from the Scream, the painting. And the model, her hands go through the actual outfit and were the hands holding that character's face. And none of that is so, like, none of the circles, the halo around the actual character is sewn down for a reason. As the model starts walking, the world around the Scream's character starts falling apart, collapsing and caving in on itself. Like the feeling that we might have when we have anxiety. The world is caving in around us. That feeling of being claustrophobic or feeling stuck. The back of the outfit has all of this texture on it, which is meant to be a visual representation of what anxiety can look like. But as the model becomes more so the character and the world around her begins collapsing, she, at the end of the runway, screamed at the top of her lungs on a rooftop in New York. So with the movement that I like to create in my work, I also like to add an element of performance. So I think that's also something that design can help bring out, right? I mean, I personally feel very performative in certain outfits that I wear, whether it be alone in my room or in a crowd. I have a different persona when I put things on, and I like adding that and emphasizing that level of performance in my collections. And then this last look, homeostasis, which I really have to credit Rhonda and Parallax and everyone for, I think, presenting it in such a beautiful way. So again, I'm very grateful. But this last look is meant to represent balance, the feeling of hope when you find that soulmate. And it can really be summarized in those 6 words that I mentioned. Soulmates will always find a way. So each of these circles on the outfit, as opposed to the circles that you see at the very beginning of the collection, which are sewn very, very specifically to create this collar around the actual model, those are sewn very loosely. So they just fall and drape, meant to be this sort of whimsical finale piece where the soulmates did possibly find a way. And so you see this juxtaposition and this contrast of something dark and constricting, something light and airy. This juxtaposition also of, right, this color of white, which is meant to represent innocence, but also it's the last part of the collection. It's the human experience. So then there's that representation of maturity, which I wanted to emphasize in that as well. Yeah.
Okay, this is amazing. What I want to share with the audience is that this collection is conceptual and it serves a deeper purpose when it comes to fashion communicating story. And what happens in the fashion world and for designers like Kyle is they get pushback. You know, not everybody understands it, not everybody believes in it, and the fashion industry system says, oh no, I'm too scared of this is not saleable. So when we had our conversation earlier, Kyle had mentioned, he goes, Rhonda, you know, I did get pushback.
Absolutely.
Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean,
and how did you overcome that?
In a lot of these very abstract looks, people did say it's not marketable enough, it's too weird. But and Allison, you might be able to relate to this as an educator. At the time, I was leading art programs for It was all girls in Los Angeles who were experiencing trafficking, housing insecurity, gang violence. And I remember when I told them, I don't know if I should even have this collection. I don't know if I should take that piece out. Like, I felt heartbroken because I put so much love into this collection and into this narrative. I remember being on the phone with all of my students, you know, who are just teenagers, you know, these 15-year-old girls. They said, Kyle, get it together. They said, we know you better than those critics. We know that you want this piece. Sure, take a look objectively, step back, edit if you feel like you need to. But we believe in this. We believe in you. They actually designed all the jewelry for the show too. I gave them that opportunity. I said, you know what? I don't have time for this. I want to also give you a little bit of access. I want to also present you with an opportunity to create something for New York Fashion Week. So I really owe it to the people around me who would tell me, get it together, who would really tell me to trust in the vision that I created, to look back at the narrative that I wrote, the essay that I would write, and see maybe that outfit didn't belong because maybe it didn't fit the actual narrative. But they told me to trust myself. And to be honest, that's the only way I got through it, was through the support of people. I remember I met for the first time this guy when he was visiting Los Angeles from New York. That's where he grew up. And I remember at the time, there were people in my life very close to me who said, we don't care about your art. It's not our thing. We're not in fashion. So we just don't support that. We don't want to come to your show because that's not our thing. And I remember meeting this guy for the first time. You're just getting coffee, and each other. And he said, do you need a place to stay in New York when you're there? I'll come to your show. And since then, we've been very, very good friends. So it's all about, you know, the people in my life. I think in a very poetic sort of circle, the people in my life, the vibrations that they've given me, the way that they've impacted me is how I was able to get over that that insecurity. And I remember when I had the opportunity to finally leave my collection on a garment rack at the venue for the first time. I went as soon as I could in the morning because I wanted to finally have this collection out of my hands, you know, and remember, I had started working on it the summer of 2020, and I didn't get to show it until September 2021. So for the first time, I remember that day, was able to take this collection and give it to someone else. So that way I can no longer stress about it, worry about it, or anything. And I went back that night for a party for all the designers, and around my garment rack were these two women. And at first I was a little concerned that maybe people were tampering with my clothes. I've had that happen before at other shows. And when I got there, they said, are you Kyle? Your name is above the garment rack. And I said, yes, that's me. And all they said was, we've been wanting to meet you all day. It turns out one of them is a jewelry designer who actually made the ring and the necklace that I'm wearing. The other is a luxury handbag designer. Turns out they live in Long Beach, California. We've been inseparable ever since. And that was honestly the first time that I really got that confidence in the work that I was creating. Because throughout this whole process, you know, I mean, my students, they obviously inspired me, but my friend who, you know, I stayed with, and these two at the time random strangers, none of them at any point when I met them had any stakes in supporting a friendship or the relationship with me, but they were so kind. They believed in my work without ever meeting me. And that was the first time I really gained that confidence. And I just showed in Los Angeles this past month, and that collection was very safe. It was pretty, it was beautiful, but like the jacket I made is from that collection. I had to put silhouettes, but now I have that confidence, and I gained even more confidence just being in this exhibition with you to really create those controversial waves.
Yes.
I feel like now I have a platform to really tell some stories that I don't necessarily think a couple of years ago I would have ever felt comfortable with sharing.
Right. No, it's fine. And it's such a challenge to have this type of work in the space that we're in today when it comes to fashion. And, you know, I look at fashion as a marker of our time, just like art. It has its historical and cultural context and significance, but we don't look at fashion that way. So, how do you feel fashion will work within an art medium and work within this context of art? Because the show is about art and the medium happens to be fashion.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
Well, what I love about fashion is, like Rhonda mentioned when we were talking when we were doing our interview, fashion is, in my mind, the most encompassing form of art because it is design, it is movement, architecture, but it's also juxtaposed in political, social, and cultural contexts. I think fashion is inherently political, but it's also not. I've also told people they're just clothes. But I think there's a lot of nuances to this industry from a creative standpoint, right? I think even the social supply chain of a garment, even of just a plain white t-shirt, is really interesting to think about, right? This is a shirt that's made out of cotton. Where did the cotton come from? Where did it grow? Whose lives were impacted in that process? Why are there people who are working in the cotton industry? Is it because they enjoy it? Is it because maybe they need to do it? They have to in order to survive. And to think about where this t-shirt then went in the process, from growing the cotton to creating all the fabric, to pattern making it, to sewing it, to selling it, to now me. Whose lives are we wearing? That's what I think fashion can also really represent. If you look at the pieces that you're all wearing now, how many of us have ever thought about whose lives were touched in the process of creating this piece, whether it be something that's an extraordinary dress or suit, or maybe it is just a t-shirt or a pair of socks. How many people's lives were impacted through this whole process? And then thinking about that, the retail supply chain, it's a whole other layer of complexity that's involved with it. But I think it is challenging to be an artist in this space. And for the longest time, when I entered this industry, I was grappling with that battle, right? I think so often when people think of a fashion designer, they think of, what is either on a runway, those beautiful dresses, or maybe they think about what you can buy at Target. And I first said, you know what, yeah, okay, that sounds great. I want to be selling my stuff at Target. I'll make a lot of money that way. But then I had to go back to that little kid who was always drawing at parties in the corner. My parents always said I could draw before I could talk. Who always said when asked, what do you want to be when you're older? Who always responded with, I want to be an artist. So in a way, being able to present and create collections like Multipolar Existence, it is an homage to that little kid. At the same time, it's an homage to everyone and how we can experience what art is. I think what's also so special about design, just like a painting, it can be interpreted in so many ways. I remember I made a collection in 2019, which we didn't realize actually Rhonda was there in 2019 in LA, and we didn't make the connection until yesterday. But it was called Broken Angel, Fallen from Grace. And it starts out with this huge dress that's all black. It's just essentially this giant half sphere. It's about like 8 feet wide. And she has this ring around her, so she can't move her arms. And then she has something very familiar, the hat on her too. So she can't really see, she can't really move her arms, and she's just walking at a very slow pace down the runway. And then the models start walking past her at the normal speed. It was inspired originally, this was my interpretation of the designer Cristobal Balenciaga's relationship with the Catholic Church as a gay man. which is a relationship with which I identify. An angel who lost their wings. But it could also be interpreted just as that angel who lost their wings. I don't know about you all, but I felt lost several times in my life. I felt like I was that angel losing my wings. And it was meant to be open to interpretation by the audience. It was meant to be incredibly abstract, so that way people could make it real for themselves. Because I think that's the best way that art can exist, is it's real. The interpretation is real for each person, for each individual person, whether that be a standard context or not. So that runway show, that angel who lost their wings was looking essentially at her life from a retrospective angle. And with this collection, having performance, and I think fashion can really exist as an art form if given the proper space for it. And so often than not, designers are not given the space, because designers are still told, well, how much money are you making from this? Where are you selling? Where can I buy your clothes? They're not necessarily meant to be bought. They're meant to be felt, maybe physically or emotionally. They're meant to be seen. They're meant to be absorbed by the audience, just like a painting. But I also think, I think it really exists here in this space today with all the designers. Fashion is just like those murals that we're painting through Arts Bridging the Gap, a record of the cultural zeitgeist. It protects what history has shown, but it's also talking about what history will be 20 years from now. It exists as this kind of paradoxical form of art, right? Like that's why we see trends coming back. And yes, it's stylish and whatnot, but there's a deeper layer to that, because it is recording what the current and the past and the future socio-political and cultural zeitgeist are, will be, and have been.
So, okay, so given that, and this is your platform, which is wonderful. I think you should continue to do this, obviously.
Thank you.
Where are you going next as far as development of your work? So what's on the horizon?
So for the longest time, I've actually been invited to do Paris Fashion Week, pretty much actually as soon as this collection walked off the runway. And I've been preparing for that, but I stopped over the summer because I was asked to do a very special show in Los Angeles during LA Fashion Week. And I couldn't say no to it because the whole prompt was about inclusivity. So my models who walked on the runway had different disabilities. The opening look was this dress, all flowers covered her body. The model has Down syndrome. There was a model who wore this jacket with a really fun pair of pants, who is blind. I made it so that way he could feel 3 different textures in the actual outfit. There were 2 models who are deaf. One of them, she had a leather jacket on with all these pearls, and another one had a cape on with these pearl strings hanging down these beads in the back in the skirt. They could finally make noise, because when the pearls would clang together, it made noise, whereas they can't make noise verbally. So I wanted to play a lot with intentionality. The model in my last look, which was this big gown, was worn by a man who has a form of muscular dystrophy. It's easier for him to put a skirt on, apparently, than it is his own pants every day. But how often has he ever been given the opportunity to do that? Because the systems that we're living in tell him not to. So I just finished that show, and again, I'm really inspired to go further. So for whatever show it may be next, maybe it'll be Paris, maybe it'll be New York again. I want to tell these deep stories. So I just asked a sneak peek. I want to tell the story of Judas and Jesus from the Bible from a homoerotic standpoint, that maybe they were lovers. And I want to go really far with it. I want to tell this story in a very poetic way, really challenging the systems. I think that already is going to get a lot of criticism, even just based on the concept. But I'm ready for it now, because now I have that confidence. that's really all I wanted to do, is to create these stories that are very controversial. But I've never been given the platforms until more recently, and I've never had the confidence until now to actually be able to implement them and execute them. So I'm really excited.
You know, fashion designers that are studying fashion in school don't necessarily think like you and I'm going to build stories. That's my future, because they're thinking it's art and how am I going to eat and how am I going to make a living. And I think there's some students here today that I'm going to probably ask the question that you may be wanting to ask, which is how do you make a living at this? I don't know if you want to elaborate on your situation, because every designer and everyone chooses a different path to still create art. Some can make a living at it. Some choose maybe not to. They want to really stay out of the system and create beautiful work and still find ways to feed themselves to make a living. So just share with us your.
Yeah, so I obviously earn an income as the executive director of Arts Bridging the Gap. So that's where I do receive the majority of my income. But from a design perspective, I work a lot with individual clients for red carpets, especially living in Los Angeles. So one of my dresses actually was just at the Oscars this past year. I've worked with a lot of professional ballerinas. So Georgina Paskogan from the New York City Ballet, Jin Ying from Martha Graham Dance Company, and then Miriam Miller from the New York City Ballet actually wore this dress to the grand reopening of the New York City Ballet after COVID. It was 2 weeks after my New York Fashion Week show. And I remember I was in the airport, JFK, New York, getting ready to hop on my flight back to LA. And I get a call from a stylist 2 days after my show. Miriam Miller wants to wear your dress. Can you come back in 2 weeks? So I did. 2 weeks in LA, 2 weeks in New York, 2 weeks in LA, and then back to New York. So I work with a lot of individual clients. So coming up, I actually have several wedding dresses that I make. And what I like about that is it kind of forces me as a designer to put that ego aside, because you're working individually with a client who wants something very particular for a very special day. But it's also very personalized, and it's fun to engage with a client at that level, even to ask them, what parts of your body do you feel comfortable showing, and what parts of your body do you not feel comfortable showing? I think a lot of us are never asked those very basic questions when thinking about even what we can find at a store, because maybe some of those things don't even exist for many of us on a regular basis. So I do work with individual clients quite often, and that's how I also earn quite a bit of income. But it's fun to make a personalized experience and to share their stories with the world. Yeah.
I'm glad you answered that, because I imagine there's some in the audience and children is laughing. You know, it's like, how do you, because there's a lot of creative people that do amazing work in the audience that, you know, that have to balance and struggle with this. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing. Allison, should we open it up for
Yeah,
questions?
do folks have questions for Kyle?
We can build off of that last, if anyone else comes here, build off the last question of, you know, how do you balance the art and staying true to yourself with the art, and that's your mission in life, you know, because it really feeds your soul versus, you know, there's sometimes a commodity or commercial aspect that you have to work through or work with in order to support yourself. So, you know.
Yeah, so it could be about professional practice in
Yeah.
terms of thinking about that aspect of it, or anything specific about the collection.
So do you do men's wear as well?
I do. Yeah.
I mean, you know, in between.
Yeah. Yeah. I like just to create. So, I got negative feedback when I presented my last collection for a man wearing a dress. And that's when I responded with, they're just clothes, you know? But yeah, I do all sorts of clothing, all different styles. Again, if it's up to me, it'll have something really different in terms of silhouette, right? But even taking a very basic shape as a leather jacket and then creating something a little bit more flashy, I like to do. But yeah.
Because I think menswear is changing faster than women's.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, building off that question, I was really curious because you've got these looks where like like the clothing is either physically restricting the body or impacting the body in some way. And then it was interesting to hear you talk about the latest collection that's about like thinking about just the role disability plays in terms of the like how do you respond to the body? And I'm very curious about like whether it's the female form, which we're obviously really inspired for here, but how does the body actually inform the design work that you do? And like, where does that come into your process?
Yeah. So for me, taking this last show I did as an example, it was really important for me to listen to the model. With these, it was a little bit easier because I knew I was working with the same like standard typical model that you see on the runway. So it was a little easier for me to kind of navigate that. It's like they're used to these things. But it was really important for me when thinking about, what the industry calls real people, to think about what limitations that they may have, or to think about the things that could support them. So even like on the runway, that man who wore the dress, he walked with a cane that we bedazzled. Even like that alone is a fashion statement. And I remember even asking him when he tried the dress on, I was like, it looks like it's hard for you to walk in. It's hard for anyone to walk in. It was huge. Would it help if you had your cane? And he said, I didn't even think that was a possibility. And I'm like, well, yeah, let's do it. And his response was, I would love that, because that puts this I think is a whole personal preference for anyone, but he told me that he loves that because it puts his disability in the spotlight for people to see. And in a way that is not seen as being a negative thing, but it's something celebrated because it's part of who he is, and he was being celebrated. So I think it's really important for me to, and for any designer, to think about when we're working with people, how do we make them feel like people? Especially I think models who are in the industry, so often they could be seen as like clothing racks. And how can we really develop this kind of social consciousness to uplift them while still being able to share whatever the designer's art is, and to share what the vision is of the collection or whatever it may be. But just thinking about people, I think my models are honestly some of the best models I've ever worked with, and they're incredible. If anyone's ever interested in runway shows, one of my tips is, one part of my process is, I write every single one of my models a handwritten letter to thank them individually, and I give it to them right before we go on the runway, and I do a little pep talk backstage where we're all together, and we all, depending on the noise level, we might cheer or we might come in a little bit more of a breath, but it's something very personal. But I really try and get to know whether they be models or clients, in order to make sure that the outfits are responding to them just as much as they respond to the outfits.
Sure. Other questions from the room?
Thank you.
And I'm curious how that you can give like ideas of your process of how to do it in terms of
Yeah, so again, like, please check out some of the stuff I brought. I have my inspiration journal, the essay that I wrote about the collection, some of the original sketches of these pieces that you see, the final sketches, and then images of my final fittings with my muse model. For me, when I try and share a story like this one, for example, I do my best not to even look at inspiration of other designers. I find quotes, I find images in, books, pictures that I take of nature. I try and find those things to inspire me. Maybe I'll look at designers for like some design details about like, oh, how can I construct, this certain element. But for me, I try and find nature, or I try and find inspiration in a way that is a little bit more, I would say, non-traditional. It starts with really kind of thinking like, what story do I want to tell? But also what stories haven't been told yet? What stories need to be told? And so it's hard because it's the idea that you don't know what you don't know. Because it's like you don't know exactly what needs to be told because it might not have been told yet. So it's really pushing yourself out there, but also letting go of any kind of restriction that you may have from a social standpoint, right? Because whatever story that you want to share with the world, and this is for anyone in any art form, it deserves to be heard. It deserves to be listened to. Like, that's why you are creating it. So that's a little bit of a roundabout way to explain my process. But
I love your jacket.
thank you.
It's awesome. And I'm wondering, is your jacket, what's the story of your jacket?
Yeah. So, one thing that was challenging for me with that collection that I showed in LA was I wanted to make it a little bit more marketable. So if you ever want one, let me know. But this whole collection was inspired by a flower surviving in a hard world. And it was inspired originally by the quote from Alfred Tennyson, "If I had a flower for every time I thought of you, I could walk through my garden forever." But it was then related to, yes, this flower blooming. So this was kind of the hard element. It had these hands with this beautiful white brocade. So to see that contrast, I thought was interesting, but it came fairly much right after the dress with all the flowers on the model that's down. So this was one of like the hard elements. This was surviving in a hard world with the hard fabrics, the hard lines, the metal. But I wanted that story to then relate to us as people. How do we remain soft in a world that has not been kind to us? So that's a little bit of backstory with that collection. So you see this whole story of a flower remaining subtly in the world as it becomes harder and harder. Yeah. Thank you so much.
We have a question from Zoomland.
Wonderful.
Do you think of the layers of sheer fabric in your designs as halos or veils? Is there a religious connection?
There wasn't really a religious connection in the majority of them. I did actually, though, want to create a very much a halo effect in look 6, Anxiety, because I in a way, I wanted it to look like a halo around almost like the icons of like Virgin Mary or something that you see, but then it's ironic. It's like instead of a religious icon, it's the scream. So it's an interesting note to think about. This didn't have as much religious inspiration, these pieces, but it's interesting because I go back to a lot of religion and mythology in a lot of the work I do, right? The last collection I did with, inspired by Cristobal Balenciaga and his relationship with the Catholic Church, and then my next one, because I think those are stories that are so fascinating because they're, again, rooted in so many political, social, and cultural contexts. And I like the idea of reinterpreting some of these stories in a way that's maybe new or from a different perspective. I also like them because inherently they are going to be controversial. People are going to like it, people are going to love it, people are going to hate it or dislike it. So I often use that as a jumping off point.
Yeah. But I mean, yeah, it's interesting though, just to even think about like the visual vocabulary that like sheer fabric has in that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's cool. Yeah, you should.
So much admiration for your creation and then
Yeah.
the specific work that you're doing. I'm a designer and an educator and filmmaker, and I'm just so curious how to balance all these important work that you do, and I'm just wondering, like, for fashion designers, I just know how much work we have to pour into bringing our creations to life. Like, I'm curious, do you have a production team supporting you? Do you get any sleep? Do you pull all-nighters? Like, how do you sustain yourself and how do you protect your creativity and like, take care of yourself so that you can continue doing this incredible work?
Oh, first off, thank you for the kind words. To answer one of your questions, no, I do everything by myself. So I have a sewing machine at my house. I have garment racks and dress forms. So I make everything on my own from concept to creation. And I enjoy that because from the very beginning, but that's also why it's so hard to sometimes give your collection away at a runway show, to put it on that garment rack. It's hard to finally separate yourself from it because of the cut part of it. And I'm sure you experience that all the time. In terms of balance, I honestly think I have better work-life balance now in this new role, ironically, as the executive director of an LA County-wide organization, because I've intentionally created that for my team. Because I work with artists, I work with like 50+ artists all over LA. For me as a leader, it's important to create a culture of care. An example is every Friday, I write them, Arts Bridging the Gap, ABG for short. I write them a newsletter, an internal newsletter for my board members, my team, called TGIF ABG. And I will bold each of their names and write a couple sentences about each of them. Like, Rhonda, you did an incredible job setting everything up. I couldn't have done it without you. And going down each name, each person, so that way they feel valued. But also in order to show them that authentically, I need to value myself too. I need to show them that I am valuing my creative space just as much as I'm valuing theirs. And I think it's important, regardless of who you are, to set those boundaries, to set aside time to make sure that you have time to do certain things, and to recognize that all those things that you may be doing deserve that attention. But to be honest, in terms of of a kind of a physiological perspective, like this work energizes me, and the work I do with young people energizes me. It's exciting because, like I said, I always wanted to be an artist. Here I am. But as the executive director of Arts Bridging the Gap, I just get to be surrounded by other artists all the time now too. And it's inspiring to see their creativity. It's energizing on so many levels to be surrounded with people who get it, who get that idea of wanting to create art for the sake of creating art.
Okay, I hope I can explain. So listening to everything that you said, I think I heard you say when you were younger, you wanted to be an artist.
Yes.
So thinking of that, as being a young kid, having that passion or desire to be an artist, and then you study political science.
Correct. Yes.
And then at some point in life, you work with young people.
Yes.
And you work with young people that really needed someone to come in and serve, if I'm saying right, to really reach into, and I think that helped you on even more, get to know more about who Kyle is.
Absolutely.
Even before being a designer, what it took for you to make that choice. That was part of the soul to reaching and making difference. One thing about wildflowers, you probably quiet, but I think wildflowers will get many different types of flowers in the dirt. You'll get many from those seeds, you'll get many types of wildflowers in the dirt. So I think, yesterday you had the flowers around you.
Yes.
I think you're gonna continue to prosper because you're really digging and reaching into other people first, serving people first in a way that is so impactful. And it's gonna help you continue to grow in your passion and as an artist and as a designer and everything there's still more in you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
About the powers and this energy and the passion, it'll continue to flourish because you're always saying, we're going to pull aside others in a way that's really important.
Thank you so much. And kind of speaking on that, surrounding yourself with good people who understand you, as silly as it is to say, like so many of my very good friends are my former students. And I mean, I'm sure you connect still with yours. But I think for me, and this is why that collection inspired by Cristobal Balenciaga and his relationship with the church was so important, because when I was those teenagers' age, I couldn't be myself. So then coming back now, open and out of the closet in terms of sexuality and being more comfortable with who I am personally, but also artistically, it was so exciting working. It's so fun to work with young people because I told them I get to finally be a teenager and I get to do it with you all. So it's really fun. And I love always working with youth and, to see their creativity. It's really inspiring. And they will be your biggest critics too, which is great from a professional standpoint. They will tell you if an outfit looks ugly or not, and they will back it up. And that's what I would always tell them. I was very unconventional as an educator. I said, prove me wrong, like with anything like that we're learning about. This is your chance because you should be proving people wrong. All the young people with whom I've worked with, I tell them, like, just by existing, they were activists. Just by existing and who they are, right? Many of them were young women of color. By living, they are creative. They are advocates for others and for themselves. So I love working with young people and seeing their brilliance show. And it's the work I do. It's pretty fun. So I'm very lucky.
So, I was thinking about your connections. So, I'm sure that lives. Through our confidence, ideas of our foundation in America, trade, built system on this idea and how it impacts people. And it creates a story of history and stuff. And it's a story that there are people who don't want to hear it.
Mhm.
They don't want to know it. So when I think about how you are wanting to express these ideas of history with all these stories, you're going to get all this kind of heavy.
Yes.
You're going to be told that you can't. So I admire the fact that you were really investing. No, I'm going to. However, that's also probably a big challenge. So how do you meet that? How do you say no? I'm going to put this on the wrong way. And this is what I'm going to say.
Yeah. So first off, thank you for your kind words. But that's what's exciting with creating things that are a little bit more abstract sometimes, because I don't necessarily have to tell them at first, here's the story. You just do it. And then you don't ask for forgiveness later. You just tell them later, here's what was on the runway. Here's what you as an individual, maybe who's now vehemently opposed to this work after I'm telling you this, but here's what you digested. So it's in a way, like, I think that's what fashion can do, is it's forcing these, not forcing, but it's really emphasizing these stories to be at the centerpiece of conversations, right? Even visually. I was walking down the street yesterday coming to the reception, and I wore a blazer with these flowers around it, which is from this collection. And people were looking because in a way they had to, right? Maybe a couple of them stopped and asked about the actual blazer, others didn't, but at least it was being acknowledged. And I think if we can put those stories out there in whatever art form it is, in whatever method, we can then, it opens the opportunity to have those conversations on a more in-depth level.
Any final questions for, Rhonda or, or
I'm interested in your essay. Like how you started doing your vision in text instead of.
Yeah, well, I can also show you everything, but for me, I think that's my political science hat coming on. Like wanting to be really organized in this process. And I also think it's important for me because, as you all can tell after today, I'm a very long-winded person when I talk. So it helps me, that does force me to get my ideas and to get all of this down to a more concise level where not only other people can digest it a little bit better, but so can I. So it really is, it's just been part of my practice for years, ever since I even entered the industry. When I was in school for fashion, I would do it. They might, they might be shorter or longer, depending on what the themes are, but yeah, it's just something that I've always done. And it helps me really organize my thoughts and continue to organize what each look can represent in that story.
Well, Kyle and Rhonda, thank you so
you.
much. Kyle, I want to thank you for like unapologetically just like looking at fashion as art, right? And Rhonda for putting together an exhibition that really recontextualizes fashion as art. As you were saying, there are so many complexities that go, whether it's the materials or the processes or like the imagery or how it relates to the body. Like clothing and textiles are so very complex, and no one ever questions when there's a painting on the wall, right? Whether it's art or not. And I think that that's what is so beautiful about this exhibit, and it really encourages you to like look at all the details in a way that you just don't get when you're flipping through images or scrolling through the Instagram, or even as something's flying down the runway. And so thank you both for just like creating this experience for us. And I just hope that you all get to really like engage with all of these things right now as art objects, and also check out Kyle's amazing process work and everything, and get the chance to connect with Kyle one-on-one.
Thank you so much, Allison.
Yeah.
You again, Rhonda.
Thank you so much, y'all. Thanks so much.